All right, so today or yesterday, last week we began the first of the commandments, the one where God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And we talked a little bit about the idea that this translation, or this way that it was translated, which "no other gods before me," is probably equally or perhaps even better translated as "no other gods besides me." So God is not simply saying you can't have any other gods in front of me, but that I'm the only God for you. And that's a kind of key distinction to some extent. But as we look at the bigger picture, "before me" becomes more significant as idolatry and what that means kind of changes over time. And then finally, I use the New Living Translation that says, "You must not have any other God but me," which I think is kind of a good way to put it as well. And we'll talk about what it means for something to be a god. But briefly, I wanted to talk a little bit, or mention briefly, some of the gods that by this time the Israelites had encountered in their existence. And the biggest ones are the Egyptian gods. The Egyptians had over 1,500 different gods. There were a few that were really the well-known ones, the ones that if you watch a movie about Egypt or about mythology, you're going to come across them. They were kind of like the Olympian gods, where you had Zeus and Apollo and some of the really well-known ones. But then there were all these other minor gods as well. But some of the most significant Egyptian gods were Ra, the sun god, the ruler of the gods. I mentioned earlier that last week, that the plague of darkness was a direct attack against the authority of Ra. Anubis, the god of embalming, protector of the dead, the final plague, the plague of the firstborn, was a direct attack against Anubis. Nut, the goddess of the sky, and you could kind of see how several of the different plagues could have been seen as kind of an attack or an affront against her. Osiris, the god of death and resurrection and regeneration, again also that final plague, and making up kind of the highest level of all of the gods are Ra, Anubis, and Osiris. Those are the equivalent of kind of the senior gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Shu, the god of air and wind. Horus, the god of sky, kingship, protection, and healing. Some of these gods get a lot of different jobs. Other ones, they just got one role. And then Set, the god of violence, chaos, and strength. So all of these are just some of the gods. These are some of the best known of all of them. But there are many, many, many others. And they have gods, and they have what we would think of as demigods, and they have spirits, and they've got all kinds of stuff that they believe in. And the Hebrews would have been exposed to all of this over the course of the several hundred years that they were there. Now we know from Exodus that they also had a thread of remaining relationship with Jehovah God. That at least among some of them, there was an awareness of the fact that there had been these promises to their ancestor, that there was something going on, because God talks about, for example, the cry coming up to him. There are places where in the early part of Exodus there's discussions, there's references to God, and then there are times when Moses shows up and he tells the Hebrew leaders that he's come back to bring them out. They don't need like a comprehensive explanation of where this is coming from. They know what he's talking about. So the Israelites were aware of God Almighty, but they were surrounded by these other gods. And from their perspective, those other gods must have been pretty strong, because their God didn't seem to be able to do much to help them until, of course, their God came in power and laid waste to Egypt and took them out of there, and then got a different perspective. So as they come out of there, they go into Canaan, and the Canaanites had lots and lots of gods too. We don't even know how many gods the Canaanites had. And the interesting thing is that with a lot of the Canaanite gods, different peoples would worship the same god, only they would identify it as a different god because it was their god. So for example, El is actually a supreme Canaanite god. He was not often worshipped, but he was the father of many other gods. And in fact, the term El simply means God. And so when we see El Shaddai, it is the god of, well, there's two definitions of El Shaddai. El Shaddai is the god of mountains. El Shaddai is also God Almighty. The term Shaddai can mean two different things. And so El is the name for God. When God Almighty identifies himself, though, he says more than just El. He says, I am God Almighty. And so El is the first one. Baal is the Lord of heaven, the god of thunderstorms and fertility. He is one of the ones, of course, that we see over and over again in the Old Testament as one of the central gods that people worship. And actually, there are places where, for example, I think at one of the states with Elijah, where he talks about going and chasing after the Baals. He uses the plural. And that's because Baal, kind of like El, where El could have other words added to it and it would mean something different, it would mean a different god, there were lots of different Baals that had different names added to it. And so there might be the Baal that the Amorites worshipped and the Baal that the Amalekites worshipped, and it would be the same. We would look at it and say they're just worshiping the same God, but to them they would consider it distinct because, again, it was their God. And for most peoples during this period of time, it was important that you had your gods, not just general gods, but your gods. It's a very different mindset than the one that we generally think of today when we think about God, because of the prevalence of monotheism among a lot of the people of the world between Christianity and Islam and Judaism. Those three religions have kind of dominated the thinking about how God is in the modern era, and so we don't always think about it quite that way. Asherah was the queen of heaven. She was the consort goddess to El, which made her the equivalent in terms of her authority to Baal. And so again, you had the Asherahs. There was most different groups would identify a different Asherah. There was Dagon. Yes, sir.
Just was looking something up here, and it's kind of interesting that if this kind of cursory research is correct, it wasn't all that long. So the plagues were kind of happening in 1440 BC to kind of 1570, somewhere in there.
Possibly, yes.
Possibly, it's kind of iffy on
Right.
that. Well, it's interesting that they happened when they did, because King Tut's father was actively trying to introduce monotheism to Egypt at the time.
I know that there was a king an Egyptian ruler who did attempt to do that, yes.
And that was not really all that far before the plagues were happening, and kind of like you said, there was a direct affront to their different gods and whatnot.
Right.
So I just found it interesting.
Yeah, there's a whole different set of discussions we can have about the timing of this. There are two dominant theories about the time period in which the Israelites left Egypt, and one of them had actually suggested it happened before this attempt to turn to monotheism, and that the turn to monotheism was an attempt by the Egyptians to adopt something more like the God that the Israelites had because of what had happened to them. Whereas there are others that suggest that the Exodus might have happened after that, and that there was some element of one of the kings earlier on, closer to Joseph's time, who was trying to adopt his approach as well. There's also a period of time where the Egyptians are ruled by an outside group. And some people would try to argue that that was when Joseph was in charge, even though there was, in fact, the Pharaoh was the highest level, that because Joseph was basically running everything, that's kind of that period of time, and that it might have been him as well as several generations after him that held that kind of second in command role. But the problem is, again, the records are kind of sparse. Things tend to conflict. Whatever time and date you pick, it creates potential conflicts with other things, so it's hard to say. So. But there were times where we see different pantheistic kings who, when they experience God's power, suddenly start to say, okay, he's the real God. Then they stop acting like it after a short period of time. Nebuchadnezzar does it. There's several others like that do that. So, okay, so back to the Canaanite gods. Dagon is one of the Canaanite gods. Actually, he is primarily associated with the Philistines, but there were other Canaanites that worshipped him as well. And then finally there was Moloch, and this is, I say finally as though that's the whole list, but there was also, one of the other major ones was Moloch. Moloch was significant because he was actually not associated with a whole bunch of different groups. He was primarily associated with Ammonites, and his worship included child sacrifice, passing your children through the flames. This has been alternatively described as either actually killing your children and burning them as a sacrifice, or some kind of a ritual where they pass through the flames without actually being harmed by them. The scholarship is divided on what that actually meant specifically.
Okay, the Greeks had their pantheism, and it came out of their own mythology and whatever. The Romans kind of adopted
Copied
a lot
the
of Greek
Greeks,
stuff.
yeah.
Then you've got these gods, which, as you say, were shared among others. What's the genesis of the Egyptian gods? Were they unique to the Egyptians? It came out of their culture over time, or did they copy them from somebody else?
probably, if there was anybody doing copying, it's more likely the Greeks would have been copying the Egyptians the other way around, because the Egyptian Empire is so much older than all, I mean, as a practical matter, the Egyptian civilization is the oldest
Yeah, I know
major,
they're copying
yeah.
the Greeks, but.
Right, it's the oldest major civilization. What you kind of see is similarities across the different pantheistic religions in terms of who they tend to identify as. Because what happens is they identify the gods with natural forces.
The roles to
Yeah,
go.
so the sun and the earth and the water, in very broad terms. When you look at the Greek pantheon, Zeus is the sky, Poseidon is the sea, and Hades is the earth, in like I said, very broad terms. And so they're, but then the different roles, like you said, the different aspects of it. I don't know that there's any, I'm sure people have done a study on it, I don't know the specifics of it, but I don't know if there's any specific pathway that the Egyptian gods came about any more than any of these other ones did. It's kind of just, you have the, you just have peoples that have a common identity who begin to identify certain natural phenomenon with gods, and they begin to assign them gods that, it's kind of a groupthink kind of a situation, I think. Steve?
We have today groups of people that have this same concept. And if you look at the Hopis, they have so many Kachina gods that it's an infinite amount. Because they literally have a god or a Kachina for every object or every living thing or whatever. They don't even know how many they have. But their concept of God is in nature.
Yes.
And I think many cultures disseminated all the way down to that level throughout the world. And what's interesting, if we read Hebrews 1:1, it's like God in the past spoke through the fathers and the prophets, but now of course he speaks to us through Jesus. But somewhere in the middle of all of that, people quit communicating with God.
Yeah.
And they started coming up with their rationalization of the sky god or the sun god or all these workings of nature, and they became foolish in their wisdom, as Romans says.
Yes.
But if you don't have knowledge of God, and that you're going to conjure up your facts according to observations. And so if you were to burn a piece of wood, is the wood being consumed through a chemical process, or is the heat bringing out the smoke that's already hidden in the wood? And you say, well, the smoke is trapped in the wood, and this is how you get it out. And so you don't understand the process,
right.
So you conjure up a whole new thing, and then you either start worshiping that as something really amazing or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we look at the biblical account, that process of the losing of communication with God has happened twice. It happened first before the flood, where you see this thin line of, you start off with Adam and Eve, who had a direct relationship with God, who presumably taught their kids something about it, because Cain is not surprised when God starts talking to him. And Abel is, both of them are sacrificing to God, and yet then Cain kills Abel, but Seth is born then, and then at the end of after Seth's birth, it says it was during this period of time that men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And the idea behind that seems to be that they began to actively worship God. But over time, we see that this gets more and more limited to where there's only just eventually Noah and his direct ancestors, perhaps even, that have any kind of relationship or awareness of God, and everybody else just becomes lawless. Now maybe they had created false gods, maybe they just become atheistic almost, or whatever, but whatever it was, they are not in that, they're not in contact with God anymore. They have no relationship with him. They have no, they're not in any way behaving like he would want them to. And of course then the flood resets things, and now you have again a man who has directly encountered God in some way and has had that relationship with him, and he obeyed him, and he built the ark, and his sons are presumably taught about this, but ultimately only one of them, Shem, continues in at least some of his descendants continue in a tradition of a direct or a significant relationship with God. The other two begin to move away. And many of them presumably were part of the group that went to Babel and built the tower there and basically said, this is all about us, you know. So they're already not honoring God and having that relationship with Him. And so we see that when Abraham is contacted, it's reasonable to presume, given what we see with Noah and some of the others, that Abraham's family probably had some kind of traditions where they did have a relationship with God more than most of the people around them. But there is this loss, or as Paul says, this darkening of the awareness of God and of what He wants, and of the willingness to obey what He wants, that takes place in that cycle that makes people worse and worse and worse over time. And that just keeps happening. And so, yeah, I think what happens as a part of that is these are superstitious people who don't understand, by and large, how things work scientifically, the way that I use the word understand in quotes, because it's a little dangerous to say that when we're still not actually sure that atoms are in fact real. You can't see them, you can only basically infer that this system works because it does things that I expect it to when I do certain things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the correct system any more than, you know, worshiping fire because it makes smoke is the correct system, you know. So in any event, because they don't have a scientific basis for analyzing what's going on, as you say, there is the tendency to associate things that are not well understood and things that have power that is not understood with something supernatural. Because I think that's built into humans, not because we're supposed to be idolatrous, but because we seek a connection with the divine. We started off with a connection with the divine. Adam and Eve had a direct relationship with God. That relationship was broken by sin, but that doesn't mean that the desire to have that relationship doesn't exist. And I think when you think about the duality of the human spirit, Paul talks about that fight between himself and what he wants to do and what he knows he should do, and that back and forth. What he's talking about to me is this fight between the sinful nature and the godly nature, the part of man that life was breathed into him. He was created in God's image. That part wants to connect with God, and the other part wants to do what I want. And a lot of times that part that wants to do what I want shades the want to connect with God and turns it into something that makes it feel like I'm connecting with God when I'm really just reflecting what I want. And I think that's a lot of what's going on with idolatry back then, and it's still what goes on with idolatry today.
And the desire for divine connection that you mentioned, I think that's in large part what it means when God says, let us make man and woman in our image.
Yeah.
And we're the only ones that desire that divine connection.
Yeah. And I think that that's tied into the idea that humans are moral creations as opposed to simply creations of matter and energy, which is what everything else is. I've talked about this before, but you know, when we talk about when you have a dog and you say your dog is a good dog, what you mean is that he doesn't pee on the floor, and he comes when you call him, and he doesn't wreck the house and stuff like that. You don't mean that he's a good dog and he goes out and worships God and, you know, and makes moral choices and, you know, doesn't look at things he's not supposed to look at. He's just a dog. And he's no more a morally good dog than a rock that you pick up is a morally good rock because it's solid, you know. It's made that way and it does things. Now, dogs are more complicated than rocks, obviously, but ultimately dogs are operating on about 4 levels. They're operating on the things that are built into them like instinct, they're operating on training, they're operating on reaction, and they're operating on relationships. So a dog that has a relationship with you is going to behave differently towards you than a dog that doesn't. But ultimately, that relationship is just the last layer that's on top of all this other stuff that's just basically what they don't even have any real control over. We have the control over those things. We have the ability to transcend and make decisions that exceed all of those other things, the things that are built into us, the things that we've experienced throughout our lifetime. People still sometimes do things that are way better than what they ought to do and way worse than what they ought to do because we have those moral choices. And that's a function of that moral creation as well as that sinful nature, and those two things being at odds with each other, I think. So, okay, so let's move on to actually start talking about this idea of you shall have no other gods before me or besides me. So, the problem with idolatry is it is highly infectious, okay? So one of the things that we see, one of the great dangers that we have come to understand in our modern era is the danger of pathogenic diseases. Things that can be passed on, or infectious diseases, I should say, things that can be passed on from one person to another. There are certain kinds of things that if you get them, you can't give them to somebody else. If you have cancer, as awful as that is, cancer is not transmissible to somebody else. You don't have to be worried about being around somebody who has cancer. You're not going to get it from them. If you have a cold, though, there's a pretty good chance that if people spend too much time around you, they're going to get it too. And our diseases run the gamut from those that are non-transmissible to those that are highly transmissible. And in any event, diseases are something to be avoided. Now, cold's not such a big deal for most of us. For a small number of people, it's a pretty big deal. But HIV, for example, is a very serious one. And Ebola is probably about as serious as it gets. And so it just kind of depends on the severity coupled with the infectiousness, just how bad a disease is. Well, it turns out that idolatry is about as bad a disease as you can have. And the fear that God has, and I use the word fear intentionally, God isn't afraid of things of man, but he is afraid for man sometimes. The fear that God has with the Israelites is that, and with Abraham as well, is that he will be and they will be corrupted by the people around them, by the idolatry of the people around them. The whole point in taking them out of Egypt, the way he did it, was to impress on them as well as the rest of the world that he was really God. And so the hope would be that they saw that and they got the message, and when they left, they understood that they were following the God that they should follow. But of course, generation after generation, the further away they get from that event, the harder it's going to be to remember, and the more them being surrounded by these idols and these false gods is going to tend to affect them. And so God says to Abram that the problem in Canaan is bad, but it's not actually bad enough for him to get rid of all the Canaanites yet. And we see this concept over and over in the scriptures where God is patient, even with evil people, to try to give them an opportunity or to wait until there's a level that's reached of unrighteousness or ungodliness before he will impose a final judgment. But in the case of the Canaanites, the final judgment is actually the Israelites. They serve as his solution, just like the flood many generations before had served as the solution to all of mankind's evil. The Israelites are being set up to be the ones who are God's judgment against the Canaanites. So in Genesis chapter 15, Okay, so in Genesis chapter 15, God says to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. And of course, that's Egypt. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions." And we see that happen when they leave Egypt. The people of Egypt are so desperate to get them out and have them leave on favorable terms that they give them all sorts of gifts to take them with them as they go. "As for you," he says, "you shall go to your fathers in peace. Then you will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." So what he's saying is that the Amorites, and the Amorite, the term Amorite is a blanket term in some cases that is used for the Canaanites in the scriptures in particular. So what he's basically saying is that the situation is bad, but it's not bad enough yet. And you can kind of see in Abraham's experience some of the times that he encountered leaders or people in Canaan who at least seemed to express some degree of morality and godliness. The most notable one I can think of is Abimelech. Anybody remember who Abimelech was? You didn't think you were going to have tests when you came in here, your quiz when you came in today, did you? Abimelech was the king of the Philistines, actually. He was a Philistine king that Abraham encountered. And it was the second time that Abraham decided it would be a great idea to lie about his relationship with Sarah, because he was afraid that the people that he was going among were godless people, and they might therefore decide to kill him to take his wife as a wife for themselves. And so they go in and they lie about it. And actually, I may have that backwards. I can't remember. It was Egypt first. It was Egypt first, and then Abimelech. So that he goes in and he lies about the relationship. Abimelech takes Sarah, who he says is his sister, to be his wife, and then God comes to him in a dream and says, "You're a dead man, because the woman you took is the wife of a prophet and my servant." And Abimelech says, I haven't touched her. I haven't done anything yet. I just took her. I didn't have any relations with her. And God says, and that's actually because I was protecting you. If you had, you would be a dead man. But because you do have a heart that's trying to do the right thing, you're not going to die as long as you return her and you do whatever her husband says. And so he gives Abraham a bunch of gifts and basically makes peace with him. And later on, he will make peace overtures to Isaac as well because of his recognition of the authority of God and the fact that God, something bigger than the gods he's used to, is with these guys. And so there's this idea that perhaps some of the Canaanites, at least, are not so far gone that they don't have a sense of ethical morality, that they don't have the ability to recognize God Almighty for what He is, even if they don't worship Him as a matter of course.
I
Jerry?
was just thinking of Melchizedek.
And that's one as well. You have this, we don't know where he's the king of Salem, which has been associated with Jerusalem, although that's more of a mythological thing than a certain thing. But again, you're right, a king who is a priest of the Most High God and comes out of nowhere, basically. But apparently there is this awareness there. So we don't know exactly the details of it. What we know is that God knows that the situation in Canaan is only going to become more and more idolatrous over time. And because of that, that when that tipping point is reached, that is when the Israelites will come in as a cleansing force. Linda.
Canaan was the second son of Ham.
That's correct.
So
Forgot about that.
Ham was rebellious from the beginning.
Right.
Right?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I didn't know if that was the end of the sentence or not. Yes. Yes. Ham was the one who went into where Noah got drunk, went into his tent and got naked, and Ham went in and saw it and came out and started snickering with his brothers about this, and the other brothers were like, dude, what's wrong with you? They went in and covered him up, and then when Noah found out later on, he cursed Ham, basically, and yeah, so Canaan was one of his descendants. And Japheth, I forget where he ends up fitting into the lineage of different things, but Shem is the one, of course, that becomes the Semitical people come from, which would include not only the Israelites, but also the modern-day Arabs as well, who are primarily descended from him through the line of Esau and others, not just Esau. What's that?
Ultimately Ishmael.
Ishmael, yes, that's right, Ishmael, yeah. Anyway, Linda.
And I think the Amorites were also descended from the Canaanites.
That's correct, I believe.
So again, you see that same tendency from the very beginning.
The Amorites, they're from Babylon.
Yeah, the mountainous area.
They're the same, right? The Babylon and the people there were called Amorites.
That one I don't remember specifically, but I don't disagree. So, anyway. Okay, so God is already identifying even ahead of time that the situation in Canaan is going to become increasingly bad, and that's part of the reason why the Israelites are going in there. And it's part of the reason why He's promising the land to Abraham, because the land is currently being used, and when Abraham's descendants go in there, it's still going to be used. And so it's not like He's giving them something fresh, He's giving them something that where people already live, but God has a plan, and that is that those people that are living there are sinful and they're going to be worse, so giving the land to His people is an entirely appropriate thing to do. Back to Linda.
And I thought too, because when you look at Isaac and Ishmael was given a promise also. And it seems to me that was his legacy. Is that right?
Ishmael's legacy is not... Ishmael, what the prophecy says, he will live to the east.
But isn't that where all these people are from, or not?
The Canaanites are probably relatively native to the land of Canaan. They were there even before Abraham went in there.
Okay.
Ishmael ultimately was, and when you look at the Arabs, peoples in general, they end up to the east of Palestine by and large. Many of them end up in Palestine as well eventually, but historically they ended up in what we would think of today as Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and those kinds of, for a little bit further to the east. So.
Then it's also, Ishmael was born to Avram, not Abraham, because after that God changed the name to Abraham.
That's true.
And I also think that's because when Abraham has to sacrifice Isaac, God said his only son.
That's true.
Because Ishmael was to Abram and not Abraham.
That's true. I think when God says this, he's
God made a distinction there.
yes, Abraham knew, and God makes it clear in Isaac and then later in Jacob that these are the children of promise. And Paul talks about that in Galatians, I think, that these sons are the children of promise. The other ones are not illegitimate. They are not sons, especially when we talk about Isaac and Isaac and Esau, Jacob and Esau. Esau, they were twins. I mean, there couldn't be anything illegitimate. It's just that Esau was never chosen. He was never part of the lineage. And so even though he was the son, he was not the son. And so when you talk about Isaac versus Ishmael, Ishmael is this son that's not part of the covenant. He's outside of the covenant, and so Isaac is the one that Abraham's waiting for. So, and of course, Abraham actually goes on to have 6 more sons after that, after with another wife after Sarah dies. So, just because you're Abraham's son doesn't mean you're part of the promise, the family business, I call it. So, okay, so. The problem, the thing that God is concerned about is, like I said, is that when the Israelites get into the land, they are going to encounter a bunch of people who are worshiping gods that God is not their God, and that they will adopt that. And so one of the things that God puts into place is a series of different sort of things that they're supposed to watch out for. Watch out for God, people who say something that isn't true. And in particular, one of the things he says is, if you have somebody who claims to be a prophet of God, and they come and they give you a sign or a wonder and it doesn't come true, then you know that's not a real prophet. Don't listen to them if they don't know what they're talking about. What's interesting though in Deuteronomy chapter 11 is that God said, or Deuteronomy chapter 13 is that God says, even if it does come true, there's another test you need to impose. So he says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or wonder, and the sign or wonder comes true, concerning which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So God says, look, first of all, if they're wrong, don't listen to them. But second of all, if they're right and they still say to do something that I didn't tell you to do, don't listen to them. And it's interesting because he says, I'm testing you if that happens. And you think, that seems kind of mean, you already want them to figure out if it's going to come true or not, and now you're saying even if it does come true, they still shouldn't listen if it's opposed to your will because you're testing them. Why would he lay this out like this? Why would he set it up like this?
Well, he does the same
Hang on, you can raise your hand and she did.
Sorry.
It's because God is on the top and we have to listen to him. And if he sends a prophet to talk to us, or we don't have him today, but then, he sent prophets. They were real and they were sent by God, but not everyone was sent by God. You have to listen to him.
Okay.
And it's the same today.
True. Jerry?
I was just thinking he did the same thing with Job, that he tested him, and he also does it with Peter. It says he allowed Satan to test him.
Okay.
So,
All right, we got 2 hands. Let's start with Barbara and then I'll go to Ken.
Well, I was going to say, we get into the same thing. We're told in the Bible to listen to the authorities of this country and, the ruling government or whatever. But if they came in and told us we could not worship God any longer, we would have to still go with God rather than listen to the authorities of this land.
Yeah.
And that is basically the same thing. They're telling us all the laws and what we're supposed to do. And if it goes against what God teaches us, then we're not supposed to do that.
Right. Okay.
I think it ties back to the very command that we're looking at, have no other gods in front of me, beside me, other than me. I'm going to test you with powers that look like they're coming from a God. Paul says the same thing. Satan and his minions are given the power of lying, signs, and wonders. Now, how that plays out in the world today, I don't begin to understand. But even Jesus said, many false prophets and teachers will come in claiming to be the Christ or claiming to say that person is the Christ. And he says, don't listen to them either. And so God is trying to make sure that we have our only total and complete allegiance to Him.
Yeah.
And we can do that by listening to what He says, and that's our ultimate filter against everything else that we hear.
Yes. Steve?
So God tests and Satan tempts, and God never tempts us. So the testing, though, to me is the idea of a crucible and purification. And so as God tests us, He's testing us for our purity. How pure are you? What's your trust level today? And if we're found worthy, then we pass that test, but we fail the test a lot.
And actually, the testing itself can help to increase our purity. In fact, that's the notion of the crucible, is that you go through something and it forces the impurities out. And so it leaves you with something better if you do pass through it. So.
And it's also, He doesn't test us not letting know what His will is, but have it right here.
Right.
So if it doesn't line up with that, you better watch out.
Yeah. And that's an important point here, is He doesn't say, you know, that the prophet comes to you and says something that, you know, breaks my commands, and He doesn't give them any explanation of what He's expecting. He says, let's go after other gods who we haven't known and let us serve them. The thing to remember is the Old Testament, much more so than the New Testament, tends to state things in terms of God is doing this. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, as opposed to Pharaoh makes bad choices or chooses to ignore God. And in this situation, God is reminding them that He's in control of the situation, but nevertheless, that doesn't mean that they should just do whatever the situation seems to call for. And in particular, I think in this context, it's important to remember that just, you know, a sign or a wonder may be something as simple as, or I say as simple as, something like an eclipse, for example, would be considered a sign or a wonder to the people of that period of time, because they don't know what those are. And you know, somebody who maybe got lucky or, you know, whatever, could end up coming up with something. But beyond that, here, and here again, we talked about this a little bit previously, there are, as Ken points out, there are examples in the scriptures of people who were either possessed by demons or who were operating using, with to some extent, some sort of demonic or evil spirit influence that was giving them the ability to do things that were abnormal and potentially supernatural. I think of the girl who followed Paul around yelling what his purpose was, and who the script, it talks about that she made lots of money for her owner because she was a fortune teller. Well, at some point, if you tell fortunes and you're always wrong or regularly wrong, people stop coming to you. And so it is presumable that she was at least somewhat successful with that. We have Legion, who was possessed by demons and who could tear chains apart. You know, this is superhuman to some extent. And so just because somebody is able to do something supernatural, God says, don't assume that's for me. And I think that ties back most specifically to what you were talking about, that you can see in the scriptures where Paul says, even if an angel of light tells you something different, gives you a different gospel, let him be accursed. Because Satan does have some kind of power, particularly, we seem to see historically in eras where miracles occur. That's because there are also bad things, supernaturally bad things that are happening as well. There's kind of this loosing of the supernatural forces in some places and times where perhaps not as much. But in any event, the concern is that the Israelites will be led astray not just by someone who's a false prophet with nothing to back it up, but by someone who can actually back it up to some extent. Linda.
Well, even Pharaoh has sorcerers and magicians.
That had just popped into my head, I'm glad you said that. And initially, they were able to replicate some of the things that Moses could do. After about the third or fourth plague, they're like, yeah, we're out of this. But initially, at
The
least,
gnats and stuff.
yeah, I can remember which one it was. But now, whether that was trickery, if you watch the movie I really enjoy about that, the Prince of Egypt, suggests that they were using just, kind of hocus pocus. But the scriptures don't really make that clear, whether they were able to do something supernaturally or whether they were just doing something that was fooling the people. But in any event, so it's a mistake for us to think that throughout history that whether it's miracles that are good for us or whether it's supernatural events that are supporting evil, that either one of those is simply just made up or simply just exaggerated. There are definitely situations where evil supernatural forces have done evil things. And one of the examples of that actually would be Job himself. Satan actively does bad things, makes very, very bad things happen to him. And if you want to make the argument that people who are, who are regenerated from cancer and from other things that we pray about, that's a miraculous event, it's hard to ignore that what Satan did to Job was a supernatural event as well. It wasn't like, just random bad things happening. Satan made really bad stuff happen. So when we talk about these kind of things, we need to recognize that these false gods that we talk about, they're false gods they're false gods in the sense that they are not God. They didn't create the universe, they don't have the final authority over the universe, and they should not be worshipped because they are less than God. But that doesn't mean that they aren't real in the sense of there being some kind of entity behind that. It doesn't mean that they aren't dangerous, and it doesn't even necessarily mean that they don't have some degree of power depending on what God is allowing them to do. And so we should not ignore that fact and try to pretend like they're just made up and they're nothing. That now there's not a God of the sun, but is there an entity that is doing things sometimes when people are calling on it? I don't know. I didn't live in that time period. But we need to be careful about making the assumption that false means not real as opposed to false means lying about what they really are. Those are two very different things. Jerry?
I was just thinking about 1 Corinthians 13 and 14, where he's talking about the special gifts that the Christians had, and that those are going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that the reason they're going away is they've done their job. They've exposed the world to Christianity. And in so doing, some of those gifts were getting rid of these other gods that people had, the spirits, the evil spirits that they had. And I've kind of assumed, maybe it's not in 1 Corinthians 14, but that went away at the same time the miracles went away. We don't see spirits now in people, and it just, to me, the need for the spirit was to show the power of God. And if that has already been done, then maybe the spirit's gone away as well. The evil spirit.
Okay, so let's get your thought. Go ahead.
I also, in this also, they say deliverance churches and things, they're not necessary. Earlier people were demon possessed. Yes, they can be demon possessed today too. But if you give your life to Jesus, you can't be demon possessed because the Holy Spirit indwells. Everything else has to go. So we don't need anybody who drives out demons.
Okay.
Jesus does it.
Okay. The one counter argument I would make to that is that during the New Testament era, the apostles, after the resurrection, after the gospel had begun to be preached, were still having to drive out demons.
Mm-hmm.
So there appears to be some issue there.
But we don't have apostles anymore.
True.
And we don't have those kind of setups that they had because people were coming in. And of course they were possessed until they really gave their life over and were born again. They could be demon possessed.
True. Okay, Sarah.
I think that if we're willing to say that the Holy Spirit indwells within us, we also have to realize that there are evil spirits as well.
Right.
And so, how you interpret that, I think of Frank Peretti's books, where there's the demon of lying, or the demon of idolatry, or something has a hold of you in a different way. It's what you're willing to entertain. I agree with Sylvia in that if you have, if you're filled with Jesus, you don't have room for something else. But are we sure that there aren't demons today?
Yeah. We're going to talk more about that next week because we don't have time to do that. We're already over time right now, and this is a big enough topic, but I want to spend a little more time on it than just the next 10 minutes.